Well, welcome everyone to this week's seminar. As we wait for people to trickle in, thank you, Dan. As we wait for people to trickle in, I'd like to say welcome and acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and to express our collective gratitude for the opportunity to be working and learning on these lands. All right. So today I have the great pleasure of introducing my colleague at the School of Community and Regional Planning, James Connolly. James is the, well, until recently was assistant professor. Now he's the newly tenured and promoted associate professor in planning, who does work on environmental planning and social justice. Before coming to UBC, James is the former co-director of the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability at the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona in Spain. And his research interests focus on the intersection of urban greening and social justice, with a focus on processes of green gentrification, climate risk, and the politics of urban transformation. So let's welcome James Connolly.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello to all of you, and thank you for joining us here today. It's a real, pardon me while I put this microphone on. It's a real, Simoka, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, and I really want to add that it's an honor to be invited to be part of this series. There we go. An honor to be invited to be part of this series. I really respect and have a lot of admiration for the work coming out of the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, and for my colleagues that work in the Institute. So thank you very much. It's wonderful to spend a little bit of time with you today. What I'm going to do today is present preliminary findings from two studies that are not yet published, but are completed in the data collection sense. And they're really geared toward unpacking the challenges associated with generating socially equitable green climate urbanism. And I want to have an eye toward what this means for practice. So in all, this is an emerging research agenda for me. What I'll be talking about today is a little bit in the preliminary status, but hopefully not half-baked, hopefully far enough along that we can have a real conversation about it. So by way of agenda, I'm first going to talk about what I call the challenge of urban risk shift, and I'll focus on one study that kind of unpacks that challenge a little bit, and then talk about some of the challenges that I see at the climate housing nexus, and how this relates to the goal of creating socially equitable green climate urbanism. And then I'll end in a kind of flexible way and briefly on my current work on what this means for practice and my current emerging thinking on what this means for practice. But to begin, I thought it might make sense to say a bit about what do I mean by green climate urbanism. And there's, I think, a lot we could discuss here, but just to throw out a working definition to put it on the table, we could say that this is the overall effort to use urban greening as a response to the risks of climate change in and for cities. So greening as a response to climate change, especially urban greening as a response to climate change, and especially responding to the risks both within and external to cities. I'm happy to draw some of that out a little more in the Q&A if you'd like, but just to use this as a working definition. But beyond that kind of broad definition of green climate urbanism, I think it's important for us to first consider what does it actually look like in practice? What does it actually mean to do, to be someone working through the lens of green climate urbanism in cities? And in order to answer that question, I wanted to ask you all, both in the room and online, to imagine with me for just a moment that you are an urban planner. And this is something that I'm quite close to on a day-to-day basis. And you're an urban planner working for a city that values this sort of green climate urbanism approach. You're working in a large North American coastal city. And as would probably be the case in reality, you've been assigned a project that you're going to work on for a couple of years. And your project is to try to plan for and build interventions designed to address the risk of flooding and storm surge in a formerly industrial area of the city, surrounded by lower income residential community. It's an abstract challenge, but it's not far from the reality in many cities in North America. So you're working, you're a conscientious planner, you're working in a conscientious planning agency. And so the first thing that you do is you go out and you try to understand the context of your problem. And you talk to communities, you talk to stakeholders, you gather data, you build a dossier of information to fully address the full context of this problem of flooding and storm surge in the area. And the first thing you realize is that this is not the only risk in the area. So you start to hear about lots of other things, everything from pollution, industrial contaminants, poor housing, displacement, the risk of earthquakes, unemployment, liquefaction, all kinds of things start to surface. And you might say that you're learning that the risk you're meant to address is situated within a larger riskscape within this area of the city. So what do? Well, you have this context developed, and you're tasked with coming up with a plan and a set of interventions. You work with a team of people to design interventions that mainly target the risk of flooding and storm surge as a result of these increased risks from climate change. But you also try to account for some of the other things you've heard and try to incorporate some of those other risks into the intervention that you're designing, trying your best to kind of integrate what you can through this intervention. And one might say that while this is an abstract example, this is sort of a typical mode in which green climate urbanism might unfold within cities. But what happens down the line, or what perhaps may happen down the line given this abstract example? Well, those multiple risks that exist within the riskscape start interacting. So you've intervened in one, but the other risks start to interact with this. So riskscapes are not static, they're dynamic, and they're shifting over time. And so basically the riskscape of this area starts to shift, and your intervention plays a role in this. And so you do find that over time, you see an overall reduction in selected risks, especially flooding and storm surge. These risks decline, and maybe a few others as well. But a tricky piece also arises, and that is that over time, you see an increase in other risks within the riskscape, especially for vulnerable populations. Things like housing and health risks, perhaps pollution have increased for some of these other more vulnerable populations. And that's, to me, this is an abstract example, but that to me is sort of the crux of the challenge for creating socially equitable green climate urbanism. How do you address those kinds of shifting riskscapes over time? What we might pull out of this example is that due to interacting riskscapes, due to the fact that these risks are shifting over time and responding to one another, green climate urbanism may simultaneously reduce and reorder risk in urban space. And it's this reordering that I really want to draw our attention to. The reducing risk gets plenty of attention, I would say, but the reordering risk in space, that secondary effect gets far less attention. And that's where my research is starting to draw us toward. And we might further say that when that reordering results in increased risk for vulnerable populations particularly, we might refer to this as urban risk shift, which is to say that risk gets shifted, perhaps once again onto vulnerable populations. And that's a true challenge for creating socially equitable climate urbanism. There are lots of drivers, lots of reasons why this risk might shift onto more vulnerable populations. From my prior research, I can point to one driver, but I would say this is one of probably a set of drivers if I were to hypothesize this. One driver might be what has been called green gentrification. Don't worry about the rather complex chart on the side there, but the text here is a definition of green gentrification that was offered by Sarah Dooling in 2009 and has been kind of a working definition of the phenomenon since then. It is the implementation of an environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. And in more or less what the chart on the side shows us is that it's more or less the process wherein urban greening initiatives get wrapped up in either accelerating or producing new processes of gentrification that then may have a knock-on effect of creating pressure to displace economically vulnerable populations from a certain area of a city. What I would say is we've been studying this for about 15 years now, and we know that green gentrification is a is a characteristic phenomenon of especially the kind of the urban sustainability initiatives that have been launched since the 1990s. But it is important to say that it's not that all greening initiatives in cities are associated with gentrification. It's not that there's always a one-to-one relationship there. It's that it happens. It is a very real and characteristic phenomenon of what we're doing in cities right now, but it's not always there, and that's important to acknowledge. But it is, I would say, one driver of this kind of risk shift that I'm trying to point our direction toward. And the way I wanted to talk about what this feels like and what it looks like and how people experience this set of shifting risks in cities with green gentrification as a possible driver is to talk about two case studies that I've just completed in two neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods are the East Austin neighborhood of Austin, Texas, and the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood of San Francisco, California. And I'm going to give you a very brief, just highlight example of some findings from these case studies to try to draw out what I think are two really essential trends in terms of how people are experiencing urban risk shift on the ground and what this means to them as they experience it. So just by way of methods, I did a mixed methods approach to these case studies, began with spatial analysis of the drivers of gentrification citywide in Austin and San Francisco with green interventions and green climate urban interventions laid in as one of the explanatories. And I, based upon that analysis, selected two neighborhoods, one in Austin and one in San Francisco, to analyze. I did 59 qualitative interviews on perceptions of risk in green climate urbanism for neighborhoods selected based upon this analysis. East Austin was selected because it's what I would call a post-gentrification neighborhood when I studied it, meaning it had just come through a very intensive round of gentrification before I arrived there. And then Bayview Hunters Point is what I would call a likely pre-gentrification neighborhood, meaning it was perceived widely as kind of the frontier of gentrification in San Francisco that was moving down toward that neighborhood. Just to give you a sense, without going into the quantitative results of the spatial analysis, you don't even need them to see basically what the trend was, which is that this area in gray is what's called a priority development area in San Francisco. It's largely areas that received concentrated green climate urbanism interventions. Also was targeted for higher density. And then the map underneath it shows the concentration of gentrification in the city from 1990 to 2016. And without doing any further analysis, you can kind of see a strong visual correlation between these two things, with the exception of Bayview Hunters Point, which is where I focused my research. And Austin shows similar trends. I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what some of this data looks like. But I just wanted to highlight two things from this research. One is from the pre-gentrification neighborhood. And one big emergent trend that I found within the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood in San Francisco, coming from longtime residents as well as sort of policymakers and people with a larger city level view of this issue, is that there's a reshuffling of perceived risk priorities. And that reshuffling I was observing it when I was there. I was seeing people reshuffle their risk priorities in this neighborhood. The neighborhood had long since been targeted as an environmental justice area, targeted for environmental activism. Many large-scale industrial cleanups had happened there. It's a very, very industrial area. And a lot of new greening initiatives are targeted to come to this area. That had been the case for decades. People have been organizing for that for decades very successfully and for very good reason. But there was a sort of widespread notion that while environmental issues had been the #1 priority for decades in this neighborhood, that was reconfiguring at this point. And one longtime resident that I spoke to, I think, said it very well. She said, everyone is trying to stabilize housing. If you don't have a place to stay, you don't care that the sea level is going to rise, you don't care that your air is bad, you don't care about the quality of the environment. And she wasn't just talking about a kind of like an abstract order of needs. She was talking about concretely in her neighborhood that people were feeling this way at the time that I was there. That though they had been very, very focused on sea level rise, air quality, quality of the environment, that's falling down to secondary, to a distant second. And then in the post-gentrification neighborhood in Austin, Texas, this is the East Austin neighborhood, which was one of the most intensely gentrifying neighborhoods in the United States in the early 2000s. I see a related but slightly different trend emerging as a common trend within that neighborhood. And that is that you start to see people actually opting out of climate interventions in the city. And here people are basically attaching climate interventions to a larger set of kind of historical pushes in the city that don't really have much to do with climate, but that people are perceiving as are wrapped up together. And one longtime resident there, I think, encapsulated this trend well when she said, we're taking on the impact of so-called preserving the environment. We've been flooded where people have actually lost their lives, and we're in climate change, or just rain and rain, and you're high densifying. They're not doing the same in West Austin, so we're taking the brunt again. And this person is basically just associating historic trends of displacing of putting the burden of carrying the kind of interventions for environmental interventions on the kind of most vulnerable population. Yet again, they're seeing it as a repeat of cycles from the past with a different name. Is sort of how they were starting to perceive this. So the takeaway from these case studies where I'm really just trying to figure out a little bit of how people are experiencing these things on the ground, these kind of shifting riskscapes on the ground, is that because urban risk shift is perceived on the ground, green climate urbanism has no choice but to have a strong link with housing and larger questions of who has a right to occupy the city. And this makes a lot of sense if we think about the long history of cities. You go back to medieval cities, the walls of medieval cities, the redlining trends in American cities, the larger trend of gentrification. All of these things are largely about deciding who has exposure to environmental risk and who doesn't. All of these things have something very much to do with that trend. And so this green climate urbanism push is very much wrapped in that history as well. And for me, that push toward larger housing questions, the housing climate nexus, means that we need to have a better understanding of how people sort these things out, how residents of cities sort these things out, how they think about housing and climate issues relative to one another, and how does experience with housing vulnerability shape how you perceive climate risk and what your preferences are for climate action. And so that's the focus of another kind of exploratory study that I've had underway. I've just completed actually, where I'm asking how does housing vulnerability relate to perceptions of climate risk and preferences for climate action in cities. And I'm asking this through a survey where I've just completed surveying 1,444 renters, all living in the Metro Vancouver area. And the survey was completed with a randomized panel developed by a private firm under the Asking Canadians project. The survey has 3 sections. First is a set of very standard questions about your perception of climate risk. Is climate change happening? Is there good evidence that it's happening? Will climate change impact you in the near future? Questions like that. Questions that have been asked on prior surveys quite frequently. The second section is a set of questions that I adapted from prior surveys to understand people's experience with housing vulnerability. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a moment. And then the third set of questions asked about people's preference for climate action in cities. What kinds of things should cities be doing in response to the climate challenges? And I'm really interested in how these 3 sections relate and inform one another. That's sort of the purpose of this. I wanted to show you just how I mobilized the experience with housing vulnerability question because it relates to the findings that I'll report to you in just a moment. The way I did this is I used first a question that's been used quite a lot. StatsCan uses this question. The American Housing Survey uses this question. Other places uses variations of this question. And it asks people basically, have you moved recently and why? That's basically the question. So it's here, people move for a variety of reasons, either voluntary or non-voluntary. What was the reason for your moves in the past 5 years? And it asks them to select all that apply. Most of these reasons are just normal life things. I started school, I got a new job, my family size grew, I wanted to downsize my house. They don't indicate housing vulnerability. But some of them do, and I added in a few more that I think are important indicators of housing vulnerability or experience with housing vulnerability. So the ones in red here are ones that I would call socioeconomic housing vulnerability variables. Forced to move by my landlord or the bank. I moved due to previous residents feeling unaffordable. I moved because changes in my neighborhood, including new stores or neighbors near my previous home were unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Those are socioeconomic variables that indicate why people might have moved. That indicates some degree of housing vulnerability. And then the darker black ones here are more environmental variables that might have created housing vulnerability. I moved because of a natural disaster or fire. and moved because of concern about environmental conditions like poor air quality or poor water quality. And so what I'm going to report are just some of the early findings associated with these housing vulnerability variables in terms of how that shapes people's perception of climate risk and how it shapes their preferences for climate action. And some of this, I think, matters a lot for how we think about green climate urbanism in general. So the top 3 lines here are the housing vulnerability variables. First, we have the socioeconomic housing vulnerability results, then the environmental housing vulnerability results, and then the 2 combined, the 3rd line down, is experience any type of housing vulnerability. They don't add up because sometimes they overlap. Sometimes people experience both. And then there's a total of 1,444. The all respondents line is the light yellow. We also have results from Canada and British Columbia just for the climate risk bit, because that's questions that have been asked on prior surveys and they were duplicated exactly in this survey. So of interest here, first of interest here is that the survey respondents here are all renters living in the Metro Vancouver region and the Metro Vancouver area, and it's from this past year. So the first thing we can definitely identify is that this set of people find a higher degree of evidence of climate change. Is there good evidence of climate change? Most people said yes. 88% of the respondents this said yes. That compares to 83% in Canada and 86% in British Columbia, and that's going back 4 or 5 years. So those numbers might have shifted some since then. But if we look at just the people that have experienced housing vulnerability, that's even higher, right? So now altogether it's 91% of people that experience housing vulnerability think there's good evidence of climate change. So basically these are people that are very aware that climate change is happening. And then the next question over asks, will climate change harm me in the near future? And here there's a big divide between the respondents in this survey and the Canadian and British Columbian populations. All respondents, 76% said yes, it will harm me in the near future, compared to 47 and 45% in Canada and British Columbia, respectively. Here, timing might matter a lot because the Canada and British Columbia surveys were taken before the recent heat dome events and some more specific climate-related events. But regardless of that, if we look at housing vulnerability again, if you've experienced housing vulnerability, you have a much more acute sense of climate risk going on. And so the point there is that housing vulnerability seems to have some interaction with awareness of climate risk. I can't sort of causally explain it right now, but we're seeing some indications there. Next, I asked a series of questions about what do you prefer in terms of a response to climate change at the municipal level? Think about what cities should be doing. And here they had a lot of options: urban greening, energy retrofits. There was 4 or 5 options. Urban greening, classified as adding new green space or new green infrastructure to cities, was by far the most popular. Roughly half of respondents said urban greening is the right way to go here. And that was a pretty standard for all respondents in the survey. Whether you would experience housing vulnerability or not, there's a preference for urban greening as a municipal response to climate change. And then finally, what I think is exposing the challenge for socially equitable green climate urbanism is this element. So toward the end of the survey question, the respondents were asked, do you prefer for municipal actions to prioritize reducing the cost of housing or to prioritize reducing climate impacts? And here there's a very clear and very strong preference for reducing the cost of housing over climate impacts. It's a 2/3 to 1/3 ratio divide for all respondents. And that dynamic increases quite a lot when you cordon off those who have experienced housing vulnerability. So it goes up to 75% for those who have experienced socioeconomic housing vulnerability. So if you've been displaced because of socioeconomic reasons, or you felt vulnerable or because of that, then you have a very high preference for addressing housing, prioritizing that over climate. For me, this points at this trend. This is the tension that has to be resolved when we're thinking about green climate urbanism that meets socially equitable goals. And it points us toward a very deep consideration of how this housing and overall kind of right to the city question is addressed within green climate urbanism. So as a takeaway, even though respondents perceive high likelihood of climate risk, and call for climate action, especially urban greening as the climate action, they prioritize housing over climate. So it's not that they don't think climate risk is there, it's not that they don't feel it coming to them, it's that they feel a more proximate risk in the housing domain. And this trend is exacerbated for those who have experienced housing vulnerability. So as this increases, this divide gets stronger and stronger. If nothing else, it tells us that green climate urbanism is operating in an increasingly difficult political environment because that divide keeps growing. I just wanted to quickly highlight there's two other ongoing studies. One is a systematic literature review of the housing climate nexus, which basically reinforces this, but very importantly points us to the fact that most of our knowledge in this area is coming from the global South context, and there's quite a lot to learn for global North context from the global South experiences. They've been contending with these issues for a longer time. And I'm also doing a spatial modeling of the Metro Vancouver area over the next 4 decades that shows a shifting geography of climate vulnerability that people seem to be internalizing in these responses to the survey. They seem to be sensing that there is this shifting geography of vulnerability and they're not wanting to get caught up in it. So by way of summary, the challenge of urban risk shift shows us that urban greening may simultaneously reduce risks and reorder them in space. And the challenge at the climate housing nexus shows us that people perceive a very high climate risk, but because vulnerable populations fear, for good reason, being shifted away from areas that receive risk reduction interventions, they prioritize housing over climate action. And you really can't move forward in green climate urbanism without addressing that in a very head-on fashion. So I just wanted to leave with my last couple of minutes here on a note of what I think some of this starts to mean for practice and for what we do in cities. And I'm building off of a working paper that I developed with colleagues with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy here that tries to talk about what is this next mode of practice for green climate urbanism. And basically there's 3 kind of principles that I think some of this work points us toward or directs us toward as we develop this model for practice. And all I can talk about now is these kind of principles, not so much the model itself. One, very importantly, I think it's avoiding opportunistic interventions. And these have characterized green climate planning for a long time now, which is to say we have a sense of what the best model would be, but we can actually do it here, here, and here. So we're going to do it here, here, and here, because that's where we have the opportunity to do interventions. The more we let this opportunistic model embed itself, the more we intensify the kind of vulnerabilities that I'm pointing to today, I would argue. The second is to take a transversal approach, and this, in its most basic sense, simply means that greening interventions should never be developed as greening interventions solely, but should always be in conversation with, at a minimum, the housing and greening agencies at a minimum should be talking, but really a much more transversal model is required for green climate urbanism. And then finally, it's a push or a call to create levers for change from the status quo. And for me, this primarily means actually giving the social and ecological goals priority above revenue and financial goals in cities. I realize there's a lot we could talk about there, but I'm going to leave it at that. And I would welcome any questions or comments from those of you who have them. Thanks. Okay, I saw 1 and 2 sort of in the middle here and then in the back. Yeah, it's a very good question. It's one that I've thought about quite a bit. Sorry for the going on and off here. I think it's maybe a signal on my computer. But a couple of things about that question. I thought about not putting it on and then putting it on and not putting it on and then putting it on. And I purposely put it at the end of the survey. So I didn't ask people to make this trade-off until after they had answered all the other questions. And that was very, very purposeful on my part. But I then decided to put it on because I think that really this is the crux of the issue in terms of how people, if they were forced to prioritize, how they would. Whether the results would be meaningful or not, I wasn't sure, but I put it on there because I just said this is actually the question that needs answering. Now, there's a lot of things that could be influencing the way that people are answering that question for sure, and it could have to do with the context of the time in which they're answering it, and it could have to do with the structure of the survey, and I would acknowledge all of those potential risks to or threats to validity of that question. But at the very least, I think that the huge divide that's shown there shows us that even if I'm off by, by 20% or something there, it's still a divide. It's still there. And so I think I've reported it here because I think it's a big enough response that it does show us something important in terms of how people are thinking about this. I was really thinking if I want to know what people that have experienced housing vulnerability think about this. And I'm not so much concerned about the other dimensions of that. And so I think that question regarding that population is important to ask. Sure. I'm sorry for those online. I'm sorry. The question was for the final survey question, I asked people to make a trade-off between climate and housing, which is a bit of an unfair trade-off. I agree, because in reality, we're not necessarily making that trade-off. But I did put it in those stark terms sort of consciously, at least for this round, but I'm still thinking about whether it should stay that way in the next round. And in the back here, yes. Yeah, thanks for the question. And I can honestly only partially answer it. So I have, first let me say that this survey was designed and meant to be kind of exploratory in that fashion. What can I get and what will I be missing? And now learning what am I missing and what do I need to build into the next round? I do have a limited set of demographic information about the respondents, which I did not report here. So I can filter these results by race and income, basically, by race, ethnicity, I should say, and income. I can filter the results in that way. That's pretty much all that I have in terms of socioeconomic vulnerability information. There's also this points toward a really difficult question when you're thinking about experiences with housing vulnerability, because it's such a, what I think we often and almost always miss in our study of housing vulnerability. It usually veers toward the extreme, like who's been evicted, who's been sort of forcibly removed from their home, and that's classified as the vulnerable population. I think that's really limiting in terms of our understanding of this. And I just lost the cover of it. So I think that's a quite limiting way of looking at it. So I was trying to kind of open up the spectrum, and the best that I arrived at least, which may be quite incomplete, is these questions around like, did you experience, not so much like were you forced out economically, that's one dimension, but also did you experience sort of a shift in the cultural terrain around you that made you feel like I need to leave now, like this is just not where I want to live anymore. And there's a question in there that's meant to kind of get at that aspect of it, which is an important part of the gentrification process. It's not just economic. There's a whole range of issues that are involved in it. So I would say I have a kind of partial but not complete view of it right now, and I'm thinking in my next round about how to make that more complete. But thank you for the question. Yes, please. Yeah, I think that I've been very fortunate to be a part of a number of conversations, and it's not lost on practitioners. It's not lost on people that are trying to do urban greening in cities that these dynamics are present, and certainly the politics are also making them more visible. And so I've personally had some conversations with a number of cities, Vancouver being one of them, that's aware of and interested in trying to figure out what can be done from the at least from the public sector intervention side. And then there's a number of other North American, European cities that we've talked to. And just the fact that Lincoln Institute was sponsoring this work that I've been doing now, they're very much a bridge to practice type of organization. And it's an indication of the fact that practitioners are working to incorporate this, internalize this into their work. It's not a state of like, we're pretending this doesn't happen. I think that my personal view on this is that practitioners are starting to realize that unless these tensions can be internalized and addressed in a head-on fashion, then in the long run, you shoot yourself in the foot for the politics of urban greening. You sort of lose the advocates for urban greening because of these tensions that I'm pointing toward. And that's the bottom line of my research, which is that let's face it head on. Let's see what these tensions actually add up to and how we can respond to them. What I would say is we're early days on that in terms of cities coming up with a response. It's mostly about, and I think rightly about, putting together the packages of anti-displacement policies that have kind of come out of the housing realm with some of the greening agendas and seeing how they come together. Los Angeles has been ahead of the curve on this. They have an adopted package that does that, like a policy toolkit that does that. Seattle's been fairly ahead of the curve on this. Vancouver's been interested for some time in this issue. A number of other cities as well. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Right, so there's all this energy about climate, like being part of the program, and we're actually the real problem. Wondering about, you know, actually, you know, you have to really grasp this kind of housing problem. That's sort of the other part is sort of unpacking and mitigation. That's also
Mm-hmm.
and some things that not
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in regard to your first comment, I would be perfectly happy to flip it, and I think actually that would be a very productive framework. I'm actually quite happy for both sides, for sort of climate activists to be realizing that, you know what, we're housing activists also, and for housing activists to be realizing like, you know, we're climate activists also, because neither side works without the other, basically. And that, I agree with you. That's always been the case. It's simply a reflection of what I would say is the very deep history of urbanization. And I wouldn't take any I wouldn't take umbrage at simply flipping the conversation, but also I would say it flips both ways. You know, that both ways matter here. In terms of the adaptation mitigation questions, it is interesting, and I would just point you to one particular issue that I'm modeling in the spatial modeling bit, which is heat, exposure to extreme heat. I'll point out one interesting fact. Right now, in Vancouver and in many cities, the hottest parts of the city on average are the most intensely gentrifying parts of the city on average. And part of this has to do with climate adaptation or expected climate adaptation interventions that are coming to kind of mitigate heat, and urban greening playing a big role in this. And so there is you know, in terms of hypothesizing or modeling it out over the coming years, there is an expectation of shifts as a result of, or at least in alongside adaptation interventions in the region. But I agree, there's some that are spatially agnostic and some that are very spatially targeted. And so sorting that out, I don't know yet, but it is I agree, a piece of the puzzle, and one that I've, you know, only just begun to think about. But I think there's a lot of a lot of richer work than mine on that area as well. Yeah, please. Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. Yes. Yeah. I don't have the exact answer to that, but I can tell you for sure the answer is yes. There is a subset that prioritize climate more, even if they experience housing vulnerability, and um, especially those who experienced environmentally driven housing vulnerability, right? So they were displaced because of a disaster or because of something environmentally driven. It was the middle row. That's right. And they still, and there is a subset there, and perhaps what you're doing is drawing my attention or drawing all of our attention to the fact that there is this really interesting population of people out there that despite the housing context would still say climate is, and despite experience with housing vulnerability would still say climate is the number one target. And understanding that more, I think, is an important question. Thanks for highlighting. Yeah, Stephanie. That's a good question. And for those of you online, I'm sorry, I've done a terrible job of repeating the questions. Great, thanks, Dan. The question here is about whether those who have experienced negative conditions environmentally or pressures but haven't moved, how do we capture that group, or are they part of the consideration here? I think they're absolutely part of the consideration. I have not captured them for sure in this data. But I think especially in Vancouver, that's like a top of the agenda kind of group of people right now. Especially in the wake of the recent heat dome, I think that there's been a lot of attention to what do we do for populations that are stuck in these very unhealthy conditions during extreme climate events. Yeah, that group is essential here. I did not capture them in the data here for sure. I would say there's one other question I did not present, which is, do you expect, I asked another question, the same question, same way, but not have you moved in the past 5 years, but do you expect you will need to move in the next 5 years was another question. Results kind of mirrored it. There were a little bit of nuance. It was just a little bit too much to talk about today, but it sort of captures maybe a little bit of this group that sort of feels like maybe I'm going to have to move because conditions are getting bad. But it's an interesting, another dynamic that I think I'm also very interested in as well. Thank you all.